With every new rookie class comes a group of veterans that could be in trouble. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode, we'll dive into some of the unsung UDFAs that do have opportunities this offseason. I'll give you two more big-bodied wide receivers on the open market that the Saints should consider if Keenan Allen can't be that guy. We'll kick everything off with three rookies that could push veteran players during their rookie contracts. We got all that and much more for you on today's show. We thank you very much, as always, whether it's your first time or your next time being here with us this time, making us your first listen and being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by the Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K. They let you turn your TV into your Xbox with no console needed. How cool is that? Head over to amazon.com/FireTV Locked On to learn more. Well, I got three rookies in this New Orleans Saints draft class that absolutely have the potential to push some veterans, whether it be in their first year or whether it be during their rookie contracts, that I want to highlight. And I've got a little bit of lagniappe, as promised, a couple of others that maybe push in different ways, but still kind of push some other players a bit, the veteran players a bit. So I want to start off with one of the obvious ones here, Kelvin Banks Jr. Kelvin Banks Jr. absolutely puts Trevor Penning on notice. We've talked about that before. That was one of the first things that we mentioned about Kelvin Banks when the Saints landed what looks like will be their future tackle tandem for some time in Taliesin Fuanga as well as Kelvin Banks, whichever, orientation, left tackle, right tackle they want to use or circulate when it comes to that at that later point. But what that means for Trevor Penning is that he could be the odd man out. Now, Trevor Penning could potentially look to move inside. I haven't heard a lot of confidence from anyone within the league or players and stuff like that, kind of, or coaches and things like that kind of have been willing to kind of go down that road with me when I've asked about it. But there is the potential to do that. And one of the big reasons why you could see that happen is just looking at last year, Kellen Moore taking Mekhi Becton, who came in as a career tackle out of Louisville, out of the New York Jets, landed with the Philadelphia Eagles, moved inside and performed very well. Got a great contract with the Los Angeles Chargers this offseason because of how well he performed on the inside. Now, the big question is how much of that came down to the offensive system of Kellen Moore versus how much of that came down to the coaching of offensive line coach with the Philadelphia Eagles, Jeff Stoutland. So where did that really come from? And so where did that kind of advancement, where did that kind of improvement really come from for Mekhi Becton, I think is the big question. But if it came from Kellen Moore's system, then perhaps there is the opportunity for Trevor Penning to do what it is that Mekhi Becton did. The New Orleans Saints did not pick up the fifth-year option of Trevor Penning. Now that we are here at May 2nd, the fifth-year option deadline is here. The only player the player for the New Orleans Saints that got the fifth-year option picked up was Chris Olave. The one that didn't was Trevor Penning. And so it kind of gives the New Orleans Saints a little bit of an advantage here if they do move him inside, right? If you give him the fifth-year option, you've got to guarantee him $16 million for that fifth year going into next season. However, that's the tackle number, right? If you don't pick up the fifth-year option, you move him into the inside, and then you decide to re-sign him because he does well on the inside, you're signing him to a guard contract as opposed to a tackle contract, and you keep both of your starting tackles on rookie contracts. That's just basic economics, an easy way to go about things. But the big question is going to be, can Trevor Penning actually make that transition? And is Trevor Penning given the opportunity even to make that transition? Or do you just keep him at tackle, use him as a backup? I assume pride will get in the way when it comes to that. Front office invested a first round pick in him, all these other things. Like, you'd probably like to see that guy pan out some way and be on the field some way. But can he do it out of position? That's the thing that Kelvin Banks Jr. kind of does to Trevor Penning. Kelvin Banks Jr. could slide in at guard, but you just spent the 9th overall selection on him. You probably want him out at tackle, and you're drafting a career left tackle in the top 10. You probably want him at left tackle. You can move Taliesin Fuanga back to right tackle, his natural position, so you're not having Kelvin Banks learn a new position, or you could ask Kelvin Banks to learn that new position, whatever it might be. But you're probably going to want those two guys to be your bookends and then figure out what you're going to do with Trevor Penning. So that's the way I think that Kelvin Banks ends up pushing Trevor Penning. And with Trevor Penning's 5th-year option not being picked up, it gives the Saints a lot of contract flexibility in terms of how they want to handle things throughout this year. The next rookie that I want to highlight is linebacker Danny Stutsman out of Oklahoma, who I think most immediately pushes Pete Werner. And let's be clear, Pete Werner is not going anywhere. Pete Werner just got an extension last offseason. He's on contract for this year. He's got $6.25 million guaranteed next year. However, $6.25 million guaranteed is not a ton of money, right? Not that anyone's going to cut Pete Werner, but Pete Werner's role might be impacted by the addition of Danny Stutsman. Danny Stutsman comes in as a 6'3", 6'4", 230 plus pound linebacker who is a running and hitting machine, can move pretty well. He had a 4.52, if I recall correctly, 40-yard dash. The guy is really actually quite athletic, more athletic than you might think. Heat-seeking missile, solid tackler, really, really reliable tackler on top of all that. And then on top of that and that, he is a vocal leader, which I think you want on your defense. There are some folks that have talked about Danny Stutsman as being the potential Demario Davis replacement, maybe, but the Demario Davis replacement has to be able to cover. Danny Stutsman, not the strongest cover linebacker, but mentioned in his introductory press conference with us on draft night that that's something that he plans to work on. So if he ends up doing that, then yeah, okay, great. You got that guy behind Demario Davis that could slide in and potentially be that. But I think more immediately, he pushes a guy like Pete Werner. The Saints defense is going to see both even and odd man front. So your typical 4-2-5 nickel defense, that would be 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, as well as 5 defensive backs, might shift a little bit in odd man fronts to 3-3-5, 3 down linemen, 3 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. And so sometimes you want one of those 3 linebackers to be your stand-up edge rusher to create that 4th player that's bringing pressure on the quarterback. But on early downs, you might not necessarily want that. You might actually want that 3rd linebacker in that 3-3-5 to be the run stopper. And that's where Danny Stutsman fits in without impacting anybody else's role. He ends up having a solid role. But then the more that he plays, the more vocal he is, the larger leadership role he earns over the course of his rookie contract, and the more effective he becomes, the more playing time he's going to get. So definitely something to watch there. And then finally, Devin Neal definitely pushes Kendre Miller quite a bit. Puts Kendre Miller on notice. Kendre Miller, of course, has been dealing with injuries. He is on his rookie deal just through 2026, and these are all manageable, situations because he's on a 3rd-round rookie contract. Devin Neal comes in as a 6th-round rookie that would have been a 3rd or a 4th-round pick in any other draft when it comes to the running back classes, and I think that he most immediately ends up having an impact. I don't know if you saw Alvin Kamara's Instagram post, but he is ready to go for this season. Devin Neal would be the guy that would be able to kind of complement him and play second fiddle to him. And I think that those two can be a really high caliber tandem as an NFL running duo. And that might challenge Kendre Miller quite a bit heading into 2025. All right, coming up next, I got 2 more for you that are kind of lagniappe-ish. They don't really push the player, but they might change the role. And I'm going to give you 2 other wide receivers to keep an eye out on in case Keenan Allen isn't the solution for the New Orleans Saints. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by the Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K, which now not only allows you to be able to browse all of those binge-worthy series all over with all the apps and everything that you can find in terms of the entertainment hub, but you can further that entertainment hub with the Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, because your Amazon Fire TV Stick is also an Xbox with no console required. All you need is the compatible controller. So if you're somebody like me and didn't want to make the big upfront investment of the Xbox, being able to play all those games with just a controller and a subscription and your Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K, excellent way to curb all of that spending. Head over to amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to get started today. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller are required. Available on select devices, including the Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K 2nd Gen, Fire TV Stick Max, that's the 4K one with the 1st and 2nd Gen, and Fire TV Cube 3rd Gen. All right, family, the New Orleans Saints have two other rookies in this year's class that push veterans. They just do it in a different way. The most obvious one in this conversation, or in this portion of the conversation, much like Kelvin Banks was the guy that literally like challenges somebody for their role and roster spot, is Tyler Shuck. But he doesn't really challenge Derek Carr to be the starter. What it is that the Derek Carr situation is already kind of hanging by a thread, and Tyler Shuck provides the New Orleans Saints the scissors to snip that thread. That's the way that I think of how Tyler Shuck impacts Derek Carr. I think in any year where the relationship is great between the New Orleans Saints and Derek Carr, that if you go in the second round and you draft Tyler Shuck, you're clearly making an investment in his successor, a la Spencer Rattler a year ago, but you're not necessarily grabbing somebody with the expressed intent of walking in and competing with him for his role, the way that a Kelvin Banks Jr. might compete with a Trevor Penning, the way that a Danny Stutsman might push a Pete Werner, the way that a Devin Neal might compete with a Kendre Miller. It's not necessarily the same, but circumstantially, it has a very similar effect, because now all of a sudden Tyler Shuck walks in and the New Orleans Saints are like, well, if this whole situation with Derek Carr doesn't really pan out, got somebody we really like over here. And so I think it's a little bit different, but the same in a way. But I do think that Tyler Shuck obviously makes it a little bit easier on the New Orleans Saints if they truly believe in him the way that it looks like they believe in him, and that this isn't just some kind of fast track to try to get to another quarterback next year. Then this gives you that opportunity to be able to move on from the veteran quarterback where there's all that trouble right now, kind of get your salary cap reset going into the year after next, begin the process this offseason into next offseason, and then roll along. So I think that's where Tyler Shuck really helps you. And in a way, Spencer Rattler still helps you there too, because you've got two guys on a second and fifth round rookie contract that are potential quarterbacks for you. And so you have a lot of freedom in terms of how you make decisions around that if you decide to roll forward with that. But you got to make a clear decision there. And then I'll highlight Jonas Sanker, the Virginia safety who Louis Riddick pointed out as one of the players, along with Quincy Riley, the cornerback out of Louisville, who I didn't include on this list because I don't think he pushes somebody for their role. I think he just takes a role that's available. You know what I mean? When it comes to that starting cornerback spot. But Sanker is somebody that Louis Riddick pointed out along with Quincy Riley as a player that's maybe not an obvious, non-round one pick like a quarterback would be, that could have a big time impact within their first 2 to 3 years. And Sanker could start to have that impact almost immediately here in New Orleans. The veteran that I think that he pushes is Tyrann Mathieu, but I don't think he pushes Tyrann Mathieu off the field, out of the lineup, or off the team. I think that when it comes to what it does with Tyrann Mathieu is that it allows you to be able to change Tyrann Mathieu's role. Mathieu at one point during the season last year was kind of, pushing for more like robber role type usage and things like that. Now with a guy like Sanker who can play a little bit more reliably down close to the line of scrimmage and in the box than some of the other players on the roster at safety, you end up being able to let Tyrann Mathieu play that role a little bit more, along with Justin Reed. You're going to have to figure out how you get these three guys on the field, together, or in what situation two are necessary, or these two are the best to have in this certain situation, yada, yada, whatever it might be. But I think that Sanker, in a different way, pushes for something, but it's not about pushing the player. It's about changing the roles on defense. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Jonas Sanker ends up being utilized. And look, if Jonas Sanker is somebody that the Saints see as a star role guy, then that has an impact on Alontae Taylor too, right? Like there's always that way. And then if Quincy Riley is not playing on the outside and instead they like him more on the inside, then that pushes, Alontae Taylor potentially to the outside or something like that. So there's other ways that like these defensive back selections in this year's draft have an impact on veteran players' roles more than they have an impact on those veteran players' roster spots. So that's why I separate them a little bit. I want to take a look now at a couple of other wide receivers that could fit the mold for the New Orleans Saints. We've been very pro Keenan Allen here on the show for quite some time, and I still think that Keenan Allen is the best choice for the New Orleans Saints when it comes to a veteran wide receiver to add to this roster that is a bigger bodied guy. When I say bigger bodied, I mean, 6'2" and above, something like that, or even 6 foot and above, but just has that physical play style that ends up kind of helping out to complement the speedy wide receivers on the roster, as well as, of course, to help out whichever young quarterback. I assume Tyler Shuck will be the guy starting in week 1. And so as we look at this, I wanted to highlight some guys that aren't Keenan Allen that could be an option. And one guy that comes to mind immediately, because he already has, much like Keenan Allen, a bit of overlap with Kellen Moore, is Amari Cooper. Now, Amari Cooper's been on, I'm going to be very careful about how I say this, because he's been on a bit of a downturn over the course of the past few years, but he's also been on like multiple teams. He's moved around a bunch. He's had all these other things and everything like that. But if you go back to just 2023, he was a 1,200-yard receiver, right? But then you look at 2024, where he spent time with Cleveland, spent time with Buffalo, you saw, 547 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns, just kind of wasn't really like that able to fit into that system the way that maybe we thought that he would continue to fit into the system in Cleveland, or the way that he would fit into the system in Buffalo. Something didn't work there. And so you go back to his final year in Dallas, where he played 15 games. He only had 865 receiving yards, but he had 8 receiving touchdowns. And I think that's the thing that you're looking for. Can you find somebody that maybe doesn't necessarily need to come in and be a 1,000-yard receiver, but can come in and contribute as a scorer, right? You look at Chris Olave. He came in to New Orleans with 2 straight 1,000-yard receiving seasons, but the scoring was limited. 4 touchdowns, 5 touchdowns, things like that. I think you need to find somebody that's going to be able to, and I think this is going to be, we talked about this last year as the thing that needed to be the next step for Chris Olave, is that he needed to become a greater scoring threat. Last year, he didn't get a real opportunity to do that, but if you can find somebody else that can do that, then that's a good way to go too. And I think that is where a guy like Amari Cooper could be helpful to you. And he has the overlap with Kellen Moore from the 2020s, those seasons and things like that. You have a little bit of that draw, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. You have a little bit of that connection between those two as well. So I do think that Amari Cooper, who maybe isn't like the 6'4" guy that Keenan Allen is, but at 6'1", 200+ pounds, can Amari Cooper come in and just be a physical player? Yeah, I think that there's a real opportunity for a guy to potentially be able to do that. Another guy that I would highlight is Tyler Boyd. Tyler Boyd is a player that we highlighted years ago as somebody that would be a good fit for New Orleans and maybe should sign. In fact, I think that was actually last offseason. He ended up landing with the Tennessee Titans. With the Tennessee Titans, he caught 39 passes for 390 yards, no touchdowns. So again, you'd like to see the scoring there, but he's been a guy that's played a complementary role to T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. And last year, and being in Tennessee was his first opportunity to potentially be a featured guy. It didn't work out super great, right? He wasn't a 1,000-yard receiver or anything like that, but he doesn't have to be a featured guy here in New Orleans. So that would be another guy that I would highlight along with Amari Cooper. 6'2", 203 pounds, somebody that checks the big-bodied possession role guy, and that could come in and give you some extra receiving yards and play a certain role and can go out there and block and do all those other things. I still think that Keenan Allen is the right choice. He's still very good. He's still very effective. You don't need him to be a big feature guy, but he has that overlap as well with not only Kellen Moore, but Brandon Staley, who was his head coach over with the Chargers. So I still think he's the better fit of the three, but there are still other options out there. Where there are going to be additional options at wide receiver is going to be in the undrafted free agent class. And I want to lead off with Chris Tyrie, who doesn't necessarily check the big-bodied possession receiver mold, but has an interesting background along with some of the other unsung UDFAs from this year's class that could have a contribution to be made in 2025. Let's get to that next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints brought in an 11-player undrafted free agent class, including moving on from some veterans in order to make spots for some of these guys. And we've highlighted 3 players that we feel like have the best shot at a roster spot, 3 players that might be a little bit underrated but have really direct paths towards a roster spot. Now I want to highlight the remaining 5 and take a look at those that maybe are a little bit unsung. And I want to start off with, I think I said Notre Dame earlier, Virginia wide receiver Chris Tyrie, who previously was with Notre Dame. But when he was with Notre Dame, he was a running back. And then he transitioned during his time at Virginia over to a full-time wide receiver. Now, is he a big-bodied wide receiver? No, 5'9", 191 pounds, but blazing speed, 4.39, 40-yard dash, also added a 37-inch vertical leap, as well as a 10'7" broad jump. So him and SMU wide receiver Moochie Dixon who, according to Kat Terrell, by the way, from over at ESPN, she actually just ended up putting this out, got $60,000 guaranteed. So that's one of the higher numbers that you're going to see in this class. But Chris Tyrie comes in with sort of this interesting background, kind of Velus Jones Jr. like, running back, transitioned over to wide receiver, kind of Ty Montgomery like. We've seen the New Orleans Saints try to make that work in their offense before. So I think that there's some interesting versatility to a guy like Chris Tyrie that could make him interesting, maybe as a practice squad player, but still make him a very intriguing player. Ended up with finishing his collegiate career with 243 carries, 1,204 rushing yards, and 8 rushing touchdowns, and then finished with 106 receptions, 1,081 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of those receiving yards and receptions that he had still came from when he was a running back. He was a receiving option out of the backfield. One of the reasons why when he got to Virginia, they said, okay, let's try something different here, and then moved him over to wide receiver. So I just think he could be really interesting. I'm not saying that he's going to be somebody that's going to walk in and have, some kind of a big impact as an undrafted free agent or anything like that. But if you got a guy that you could potentially put in the slot, that you can work in the backfield, you can kind of do all these things with, I do think that there's some value to that, whether on your practice squad or potentially finding a role if necessary within your offense there. Let's take a look next at Tennessee defensive end Amari Thomas. Amari Thomas is really interesting. 6'3", 290 plus pounds. So he's listed as a defensive end for New Orleans, but he played on the interior, or was listed as a defense, like an interior defender with Tennessee. But really, he played all over the place. 116 combined tackles, 18 of which for a loss, and 5 career sacks. The Saints have consistently held on to undrafted free agent defensive linemen. It's been one of the positions where they have most commonly held on to players. Just thinking back, like this has been a spot that they've done this quite a bit. You think back to Malcolm Roach, think back to some of the other Tennessee guys they've held on to, and now you've got another one here in Tennessee, Tennessee defensive end Amari Thomas. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of what role he plays throughout training camp, where he gets his opportunities, things like that. And there's going to be like Trajan Jeffcoat, who came back or who was here last year as a UDFA out of Missouri, and then most immediately Arkansas, and then had that arm injury, that dislocated elbow injury that ended his season early. He's going to be a guy that ends up making returns. So there's going to be a lot of competition at that defensive end spot, with the Saints bringing in Amari Thomas, bringing in a guy like Tyrene Powell, who's a linebacker but can rush, and of course bringing in Jasheen Davis as well, while also drafting Fadil Diggs. Really, really populated edge rusher room, defensive end room all of a sudden. But you think about like, okay, he played on the interior at Tennessee, Amari Thomas did, but now the Saints are listing him as a defensive end. Why? Could be for that 3-4 defensive end spot, right? Put your hand in the dirt, in the odd front formations and things like that. So maybe that's a spot where he ends up kind of carving some things out, but it's going to be super, super fun watching to see where the Saints actually utilize him. We highlighted Chris Tyrie, we highlighted Easton Kilty, the offensive lineman out of Kansas State, but he wasn't the only offensive lineman that the Saints added. They also added Torricelli Simpkins III out of South Carolina. 6'4", 313 pounds, ran a 4. It was really cool, actually. He ran a 5'6", 40-yard dash at the combine, and then went up for his second run and then ran a 5'4", 40-yard dash. And so, look, 5'4", 40-yard dash isn't going to be jumping off the screen for anybody. I understand that. But to have that sort of mental fortitude, to have what wasn't a very appealing time at first, and to come back and to improve on that by, 15 tenths of a second or whatever, like that's pretty great. That's a pretty awesome thing to see. So love seeing that from Torricelli Simpkins. He's got starts at center and right guard, but he's also taken some snaps at left guard, left tackle, and right tackle. So he's played literally every position on the offensive line. Allowed just 4 sacks in his career, just 2 sacks in 2024. Both of them came against LSU, though. So feel how you want to feel about that. So, he's an interesting player as well. And again, the Saints have kept a lot of undrafted free agent offensive linemen over the year. I think Easton Kilty's the guy that has kind of the inside track, but Simpkins and his versatility checks a box, right? You think about guys like Kyle Hergel, who came in last year out of Boston College, can play guard, can play center. You can move him around a bit. You think about Cameron Tom back in the day, same thing. Could play inside, could play could play in the at the guard spot, could play at center. You think back to Calvin Throckmorton, who can play any position on the offensive line. We saw a lot of that for these guys. And so, these guys like Torricelli Simpkins as well as Easton Kilty are in a pretty good situation. Take a look now at UTSA safety Elliot Davison, 5'11", 189 pounds, really explosive player. 4.43 speed, 37-inch vertical, 10-foot, 6-inch broad jump. So you see the explosion, you see the speed there. Only had 2 career interceptions as well as 5 career passes defended, but his game is special teams acumen as well as tackling. This is a guy that has a versatile skill set that's allowed him to be able to play over 300 snaps at free safety as well as down in the box. So it's versatility, it's tackling, it's violence, it's, all that kind of fun stuff. And then it's special teams. And then speaking of special teams, of course, I want to make sure that we re-highlight James Burnup, who could be in a punter competition with Matthew Hayball. 6'6", 236 pounds, though, could be in competition as an emergency tight end if you needed him to as well. Only allowed 1 yard per punt return last year in 2024. So those are the guys that I wanted to make sure that we highlighted and re-highlighted to make sure that you're all caught up with all of these undrafted free agents. We'll probably be doing individual episodes on each of these guys, as well as individual episodes on each of the drafted picks as well. Coming up in tomorrow's show, I want to dive in a little bit more on UCLA tight end Maliki Mataval because he doesn't get a lot of attention. And so I want to take a look at where he is, what he could do, and who he could be in this New Orleans Saints offense. We got that coming up for you on tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. If you see me, please say hi. Big shout out to my guy, Lee. Thank you so much for saying hi at Jazz Fest on Thursday. Really, really good to see you. Really, really good to meet you. As always, if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. No, no, families do. Oh. Hit me up. No, no, the family's doing. Don't know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.